From Joe Rogan attacking Leah Thomas every chance he can get, to her coaches setting the record straight for the UFC commentator, Joe Rogan goes off about Leah Thomas and says it's a crime. The most famous UFC podcaster has something to say about trans women in sports. I mean, the guy has something to say about everything. But this time, he invited physician Peter Attia to the Joe Rogan Experience to talk about the latest controversy in sports, trans women competing against biological women. Clearly, Rogan's not a fan, and if anything, thinks it's a crime. For context, Leah Thomas is a trans swimmer at UPenn, who's the current NCAA Division I champion in the 500-yard freestyle category, and was named in ESPN's Women's History Month. Thomas competed in the men's swimming division up until 2019, and while she'd been fairly good back then too, she wasn't at the NCAA championship level until she started competing against biological women. So that's a general rundown of the controversy, and that's what's been ticking off Rogan lately. Joe asked Peter if somebody could completely get rid of the testosterone in their body, and the physician said it'd be impossible. Rogan argues that having more testosterone than biological females was the single most important factor in Leah Thomas' road to the championship. He actually said something along the lines of how biological women worked their off, watched their diet and recovery, only to lose to someone with testosterone flowing through their body. I guess that's the hill Rogan wants to die on. So yeah, of course the infamous podcaster has an opinion on the whole thing, but it doesn't make for much besides entertainment content really. But I guess World Athletics shares the same opinion as Rogan. Leah was competing as the only trans athlete in the women's swimming division, and some thought it was brave, while others thought it was unfair. Ultimately, Sebastian Coe, the CEO of World Athletics, had the final say, and he too believes that it's unfair, unless trans women can prove that they transitioned before hitting male puberty. That, and establish for 2 years that their testosterone levels are below 3.5. Leah can't do that. She transitioned after she'd already gone through male puberty. So I guess she's out of the female division, right? Not exactly. Coe has a solution. Well, somewhat of a solution, and says trans athletes could compete in a newly organized open category. What he didn't mention, though, is that no such category exists yet. And until it does, Leah and her supporters are just going to contest the whole thing. But back to Rogan for a second. What's the deal with Joe and trans women? If you've seen the episode of his podcast where he talks about Thomas, you'd almost think he has a personal vendetta against the athlete. He didn't hold back from saying it was a crime against biological women, and even slandered Thomas. He was relentless. To support his cause, he said Thomas had a lot of balls competing against biological women. And yes, he meant that literally. The podcaster claimed that Leah hadn't had her male genitals removed and was still having sex with women. For Joe, that's enough to discredit Thomas' transition. Seeing how he's made his stance on Thomas so clear, do you think he'll ever budge a little? I mean, he could. He did change his stance on trans women in the UFC. After 2 professional bouts in the women's UFC division, Fallon Fox came out as transgender, and it caused quite a bit of controversy. Rogan said it didn't matter that Fox had gone through post-op because she could never change her bone density. He claimed since Fox was built like a man, she had bigger hands, a stronger grip, and could beat up a woman based on her biological advantages. According to Joe, it didn't make for a fair fight. Fox's career in the UFC was a short-lived one. She went 5-1 before retiring because of all the controversy. The nail in the coffin was when Tamika Brents had to be treated for facial scars, head wounds, a concussion, and an orbital fracture after her fight with Fox. That was back in 2014, and Rogan since changed his stance about trans athletes in the UFC. He said that trans athletes are fine since the other fighter knows what they're up against. By the way, there's something that Joe Rogan wants you to know, and he wants you to hear him loud and clear on this one. He's not a transphobe. Yup, despite making comments about Leah Thomas, her genitals, sexual preferences, and how it's a crime against biological women, Rogan said that everything he was saying wasn't because he was against trans rights, but because he was all for human rights. I'll get to that in a second, but to Rogan's credit, he did change his stance on Fallon Fox years later. Basically, Rogan claims that it's fine for trans women to compete against biological women in the octagon, so long as they declare that they're trans beforehand. Rogan says the other fighter has a right to know who they're up against, and decide for themselves if they want to fight a trans fighter. For example, Ronda Rousey knew that Fox was transgender, but still claimed she'd love the opportunity to meet her in the octagon. It didn't end up happening, but that would have been something, right? Rogan argues the only reason why people aren't speaking up much about the Lia Thomas situation is because they're being woke. The podcaster claims Lia will be the woke straw that breaks the camel's back and thinks people are afraid of getting into the Lia debate. Case in point, when champion swimmer Michael Phelps was asked his opinion on the Lia Thomas situation, he said he didn't have an opinion on it and was visibly flustered by the question. Everyone online said Phelps knew anything he said would be held against him, so he simply dodged the question. On the other hand, a lot of people have been vocal about their disdain for Thomas being in the women's swimming division, including several anonymous parents at UPenn, who wrote letters to the coaching team and the administration demanding Lia be cut from the team. According to Rogan, people who support trans women in sports are people looking to create solutions for problems that don't exist. He told physician Peter Attia that it was beyond him how people could call out someone for being transphobic for having an opinion on the whole thing. So let's hear him out. Rogan says he draws a line at sports. He told TMZ that society had been largely accepting of transgendered people, and he was all for it, but not in sports. Joe says that's where people need to push back. He actually said there is a clear distinction between men and women in sports because of this very reason. The reason being, yep, you guessed it, testosterone. In case you're confused over Rogan's obsession with the testosterone in Lia's body, here's a little crash course on the hormone. Everyone has testosterone, even women, but women have less than 3.5 nanomoles per liter of blood, hence World Athletics ruling on the issue. And athletes have been known to alter their testosterone levels via supplements and injections. Why? Because it works. Testosterone converts fat into muscle, makes you leaner and more agile, and yeah, it also increases your bone density. To bolster his argument, Rogan keeps repeating how Thomas went from being 462 on the men's side to number 1 on the women's side. Based on this, you'd think he has a compelling case, right? But Lia's coaches at UPenn say otherwise. The trans athlete told her coaches back in 2019 that she intended to transition, would start hormone therapy in the fall, and wanted to compete against women. UPenn gave her a year to complete hormone therapy and reinstated her as a swimmer in the female division. According to her coaches, she fulfilled the criteria they required. Sure, testosterone might be the miracle hormone in sports, but Lia's been training since she was 5, and that has to count for something. Not according to Rogan, it doesn't. He's still adamant that it's a crime against women in sports. Maybe he'll change his mind about Thomas as he did about Fox. Maybe not. So, from her coaches setting the record straight for the UFC commentator, to Joe Rogan attacking Lia Thomas every chance he can get, that was Joe Rogan going off about Lia Thomas and saying it's a crime.